Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of the WA Running Podcast as we record on Monday, the 30th of June, 2025. Before we get to our special guest this evening, across my screen is someone who looks to have finally finished tiling his bathroom just in time before Gold Coast. Someone who potentially will be ignoring our guest's advice of sorbet the night before a marathon and risking it all with 2 scoops of ice cream. Chris the Imodium Shaw, how are you, mate?
I'm good, thanks, mate. It's no reflection on Gabby's advice. It's purely just my preference for creamy delights the night before a race. So,
What will be the 2 flavors of choice the night before Gold Coast?
usually it's vanilla as one, and cookies and cream or choc chips. So I'm pretty basic. I don't have any exotic flavor choices in there. Pretty chill.
Yeah, probably for good reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, across my other screen is our guest back home after receiving a late call up from the GOAT of Backyard Ultras, Phil Gore, to be part of his exclusive posse as he broke the world backyard ultra record, amassing a crazy 119 yards at Dead Cow Gully over the weekend. A respected dietitian, sports nutritionist, and I believe she can now add foot bather and massager to her resume. Gaby Villa from Intenseatfit, welcome back to the WA Running Podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. And actually, I must say, foot massager so far, I skipped the foot bath.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, got to stay away from those. So yeah, Gabby, you're back after a massive week over at Dead Cow Gully in Queensland. Tell us about that phone call you received from Phil, how that opportunity arose, and what was it like crewing for Phil?
Yeah, so I've been working with Phil for over 3 years now as his nutritionist, and we obviously had been working on this plan for this particular race for a while. And the Friday before the race, so literally the night before, he messaged me asking, essentially, Gabby, I know this is very last minute, but Gemma just broke her ankle and she won't be able to make it to the race. Is there a chance you can come? He says her flight is at midday tomorrow, I think. And then he's like, and by the way, I need to go to bed because over there it was already bedtime, and obviously Phil like wants to make sure that he's getting enough sleep. So I just said, you know what, I can call Gemma and we'll figure it out. Right now, I don't know, but let me sort some things out. So eventually Gemma called me, and yeah, poor thing. I could hear her voice extremely stressed because, I mean, it was quite awful accident, but she had her ankle look awful. And then on top of that, she had a massive responsibility ahead and was feeling quite overwhelmed by all of it. So anyway, she called me. Turns out that the flight was not at midday, it was at 6 a.m. the next morning.
Shit.
So I look at my schedule. I'm extremely grateful that pretty much my business is run online. So it means that all the appointments I have, all the 99% of the interactions I have are online. So it means that I could essentially go somewhere else and work from there. And thankfully, the week didn't look too intense. So I agreed. I said, okay, looks like I can do this. I was actually at a friend's house. Like, I'm not someone who goes out that often, and that day I actually was out. So I had to rush back home, pack my bags, and then like the worst thing, and this is something that no one else knows. I set the alarm to wake up at 3:30 a.m. I schedule an Uber at 4 a.m. I open my eyes in the morning and I'm like, it feels like I've been sleeping a lot. I check the clock. It was 4:15 a.m.
Oh no!
It's like, what happened? So I had to like suddenly wake my husband and say, like, you know what? Like, we need to head to the airport right now because it's so late. Ended up getting to the airport so late. Like, everything was so rushed. So by the time I finally was on the plane, I was like finally sort of like catching up my breath again because everything was like really high paced and intense. Uh, but yeah, definitely, it was really last minute, but I know how big this event was, and I knew that I know how wonderful Gemma is when she's working, well, when she's there with Phil. So I was very nervous about that part, I must say. Like, one thing is knowing the plan on paper and having like crew feel for a couple of laps. That was not too hard. But in this case, this is going to go 4 days. It's extremely likely I'll have to be there middle of the night. There was a lot of pressure there. But yeah, thankfully, as we all know now, everything went well, and we had an amazing result from that.
Oh, excellent, Gabby. So what was Phil's game plan from a nutritional point of view over the course of the race? So did you plan knowing that, you know, possibly that he will make it to the rest of the week?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working with Phil for such a long time, and every time he has an event, we have a new iteration of this plan. It's very,
Mm,
very slight refinements. For this one, there were very, very small changes. The very last race he had was Sydney Backyard Ultra, and things went really well there. There were just a few discoveries we had in terms of hydration that we had to make adjustments for, and that was
mm,
it. And in terms of Phil's plan, I mean, I know that most people have heard him saying that he doesn't have a target in terms of how many loops he's going for. And he often recommends people to plan for at least double of what you're expecting.
sure.
And he literally does that. And it's not just on paper, he actually has the food and everything that he needs for so long. So even though the race finished on early Thursday, he had enough food and planning to go all the way to Sunday.
Mm,
And it's just, to me, that just speaks of how like he is truly believing to what he's saying. Is not saying like, oh, just you have a plan. And I mean, I've worked with people who, yes, they have a plan on paper, it goes for 48 hours or whatever, but then when they get to that point, it's like, oh, actually we didn't buy enough food for that. And he does. So yeah, that was essentially, I mean, broadly what the plan was about. We are very specific in terms of loop after loop. He has detailed exactly what he's going to eat, what he's going to drink. What I love about what the way he prepares this is that, I mean, we my responsibility is to put it on the paper. He is in
mm,
charge of the execution, and it's just incredible the level of let's say detail and preparation that goes into it. Once I was there, he has everything split into loops, and essentially the crew we have to do is pull that bag that has the snacks for the next 12 hours.
it's crazy.
If something is not in the bag, it has the instructions like, this is in the fridge, you need to put it there, it needs to take this long. Everything is to that level of detail.
Because
Holy,
I saw an Instagram reel. It looked like there was like a sheet of paper that was like, it looked like a table, and they like the crew was basically ticking things off the list in a row and signing off it as if it was like he was in hospital. He was getting taken care of, like doing observations every hour or something. So it looks crazy. I guess the crewing side of things, and being able to tick those nutritional goals or whatever he needed to get done each loop.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's essentially a full-time operation, I'll say. And yeah, like I love that you say it looked like a hospital thing, because it didn't occur to me to think of it like that. But yeah, it's sort of almost like that, because it's almost like you are checking that the things that you are planning to consume are consumed, and if there are any changes or observations, he has a space to note those down. So, for example, he records how long the loop took. He records the mood he had during the loop. And other things, like for example, he was asking to make notes when he was running with a particular person, like, oh, make a note that I actually ran with this person. So we put it there. And know that he also does that because he essentially works on his race report later. So there are things that are not necessarily, let's say, there's a lot of planning or anything about the fact that he ran with this person at X loop. It's just that when he goes and writes his report, it's helpful to have those references as well.
yeah, definitely. It's. I mean, I think a lot of distance runners have these kind of habits of noting certain things that they do in their runs week to week, but it sounds like Phil's level of detail goes down to the microscopic detail, into not just how his run was, but how each lap was, how each meal was, how each like foot massage was. Like it's crazy to think like the level of detail there. I mean, you mentioned at the top you weren't necessarily on massage duties for Phil's feet, but how were Phil's toes at the end of the race?
Look, I literally just recorded a video where I talk about not his feet, but I just use feet as an example of what you just said in terms of how much planning and consideration goes into every single thing. And to me, that's what makes the biggest difference for him. There is no doubt he's an incredibly talented runner. That there is no question about that. But from my perspective, what sets him apart from everybody else is how much time he dedicates to the preparation per se. And I just his feet as an example because you wouldn't believe, and I know this was weird to be for you to say like how perfect those feet look. Like it's not even they you don't even believe they are runners' feet the way they look. Not a single blister, not a single bruised toenail, nothing. Absolutely, everything is perfect. And to me, that speaks of how careful he is about it. There were several runners there who unfortunately had to stop because of their feet, because they were having issues with blisters. It got to the point it was so painful that it was impossible to keep going. And to him, it means that there is no way I'm going to stop because of something I could have prevented.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I did see a reel that he posted where he was talking to Sam at the end of the race, and Sam sitting on the chair, and he says, how are you going, and how are your legs? And he's, oh yeah, I'm pretty good. He's like, oh, how are your feet? And he's like, oh yeah, they're good. Good socks. That's like, he's obviously got it down pat, and whatever that system is, that's what is setting him apart. What was it like, crewing with the rest of the team? We had Okana, Callum, Nathan, and Tim. Did you all have specific duties, or were you on like a roster that you were working on?
Uh, with Ercana and Callum, we were sort of in a roster. We were essentially doing whatever was required at the time. It was incredibly helpful. Ercana and Callum were there from the first day, and they left Tuesday midday. So, for example, the first night, I think Callum took it. Then the second night, I took it, and then the third night, Ercana took the biggest chunk, and that was very helpful because it meant that we did get some sleep as part of that. And yeah, we were essentially splitting responsibilities in terms of whoever was available at the time to do things. We were trying to, when possible, to at least be two of us there. But for example, at night, it was just one of us because we were trying to prioritize the sleep so we could be fresh for the next day as well. Then once Tim and Nathan came, which essentially was once Erkan and Callum left, we started to get more like specific roles. So, for example, because Nathan, he's a doctor and he also does hypnotherapy. He actually, like, he's for us, the priority was Nathan has to be 100% during the night. So it means that we will not allow him, like, encourage him to go to sleep during the day. So that way at night he can be fully awake because he helps a lot in terms of getting Phil to sleep and rest during those 15-minute naps that he gets to try and optimize that as much as possible. So that was, let's say, Nathan's biggest responsibility. Also, keeping an eye from a medical perspective. There were no niggles at all. Like everything was working really well. But from time to time, Phil will be like, "Oh, I'm sort of starting to feel something," and having that conversation with Nathan, I'm sure, is very reassuring for him. When he's like, "Okay, nothing is going on. Look, we'll sort it if this happens," and obviously, he like that helps. Then Tim is incredible. He has a lot of experience. One, because he's done backyard ultras before, so he understands the format extremely well. And the other one, because he has crewed for Phil for a really long time as well. So he has a really good understanding of Phil's needs. And Team was a little bit more helping in terms of taking Phil to the start line and getting him when he was coming to the tent. And my responsibility was a little bit more in terms of getting the food ready, making sure it was there, making some notes. I like it was not on purpose, but I somehow managed to dodge the food bath. Now I was looking at Phil's feet. I don't think it would have been an issue, but yeah, it was just something funny that was something that obviously I've never done. So yeah, it was really good in terms of teamwork, working together. From Tuesday night onwards, we did strive to be two at a time at all times, including during the night. So that's why when we were approaching, what was it, Wednesday night, as it was coming into Thursday morning, we were very tired because we were like, okay, all hands on deck this time. We all three were going to be there. because we did were expecting the race to finish soon. But of course, when it was close to the last loop. Started at 5 a.m. At 4:45, we were like, you know what? We need to start sending people to sleep because this is going to go for longer, and we need to get some rest. So we were about to, okay, let's go to bed when, of course, the race finished, or well, Sam stopped. So yeah, it was quite a whole operation there. But I would say things work really smoothly and very well streamlined because there's a system in place that Phil is already, let's say, leading, and then people you start, I guess, choosing your responsibilities from there.
Excellent. So was that your first time crewing in the backyard ultra?
I would say officially yes. I mean, for example, I think it was here this last year. Actually, no, it was the satellite champs last year that Phil asked if I could crew for a few hours. I think it was like 3, 4 hours that I did in the morning. So, I mean, yes, I was crewing, but it was not full on or anything like that. So, yes, this one was a little bit, yeah, I mean, 100% way more intense.
Yeah. So, I guess what sort of insights did, like, just reflecting back on the week, did you get like different insights from a nutritional point of view, being, I guess, a core member of the crewing team this time around?
Yeah, definitely. I would say the biggest insight was on how important that planning is and considering the crew. I don't
Mm.
think Phil's plan could work with a single person there. As in, like, for example, I know that Gemma does an amazing job, and often there's at least someone else helping. So, if, for example, someone else were to try and follow a plan to that same level with a single person, it's going to be impossible. So, when we're planning, it's like, okay, who's going to be there? How available are they going to be there? And if it's going to be limited, we need to change that because there's no
Sure.
way it's going to work. So definitely the planning perspective, and what I, as I mentioned, something that I love that Phil considers as part of that is leaving those notes. I think even though Gemma is really good at reading him and understanding it, the fact that he still has things there in terms of this is how you are meant to hit this up, this is how this is meant to be prepared. It means that it was easier for someone else to take over because the instructions were there for everything.
Yeah, it's crazy. There's an enormous amount of trust you have to place in your team, right? Because yes, Phil comes up with these, specific. Well, you and Phil come up with these specific, requirements for his nutrition, but being able to trust people to either push him to eat when he doesn't want to, or carry out those instructions, is a big deal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we were actually, the thing is that, for example, Phil, like he's so switch on and he's so aware that there were a couple of instances where he was aware that something was not done the way he expected it to be. Like, for example, his oats, you're meant to put them in the microwave for 90 seconds. And team had to rush because he was running late. So essentially, he took them out earlier. And as he was eating them, he's like, these oats were not long enough. So he sent him back to like hit them up properly. So yeah, that's how I guess I layered keys to that, and obviously how, yeah, like the yeah, the details he even pays attention to.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Well, I mean, let's move on to the real athlete that we've got on the podcast this week. Look, Simon's you've been met with Simon. We've done some testing. He's looking to go sub 3 this week. You both went to Optus Stadium a couple of weeks ago and conducted the sweat test down there. Can you tell us and the listeners what a test like this involves?
Yeah, definitely. So a sweat test like the one we did at Optus Stadium involves um, two big parts. Let's say the main objective of the that sweat test is to essentially gather two key pieces of information. One is how what is the sweat rate, and in that case, it means how much fluid someone is losing per hour through their sweat. And the other one is what's the sodium concentration in that sweat. So how much sodium the person is losing per liter of sweat. So essentially, the way that the process of the test is we want to allocate or place patches on the skin that are going to collect sweat samples, and those samples are for us to analyze that sweat and understand the concentration of the sodium. And we also want to use weight scales that are going to help us in terms of understanding the sweat rate. So the athlete comes to the test, they need to do a warm up because we want the body to start sweating a little bit before placing the patches.
Hmm.
Then after that warm up, usually 5 to 10 minutes, they need to take the scale. The reason I always I always feel like a dodgy person because I'm like just like standing in the corner of the stadium, like
The
right next to
toilets.
the toilet. And I feel like people pass by. I was like, "Oh, is it okay to use the toilet?" Like, yeah, no, it's fine. I'm just like here with
I'm just
like
waiting for a
patches and
mate.
yeah, and globes and everything. So yeah, it's just funny. But anyway, so the reason we're there is because the athlete needs to take the scale and jump in the toilets or in the bathroom because they need to take their clothes off. The best way to make this as accurate as possible, we want to remove any extra layers or anything like else that could add weight, especially since after the test, those clothes are going to be wet and is going to add to that weight and essentially skew the result. So
Hmm.
essentially, going to the toilet, get weigh themselves, come back out. We put the patches on, so it's there are different four different sites we can choose from that are validated for this test. So one is forehead, the other one is forearm. There's also chest or back. Traditionally, we choose two sides, but I like choosing three just in case. So we place three patches, and from there the test starts. Preferably, we want the athlete to run at a pace that is their target race pace, as long as it's achievable. Like, for example, if this is someone who wants to run a 5K, I'm not going to ask them to run a target race pace because pretty much they are going to run the whole thing. But for example, in the case of a marathon, is something that is realistic to ask for. And in this case, the duration of the pace is the duration of the test is mostly dictated by the athlete's sweat rate. We ideally want to get the patches wet enough that we have a good sample. So for example, if someone is a heavy sweater, and it's, let's say, the middle of summer, it can easily be finished in 20 minutes, half an hour. For someone who is not sweating a lot, and let's say we're dealing in winter, it can be up to 1 hour in terms of getting those patches wet enough. So they essentially go on the run, come back. We need to measure how long they took, so that way that's the information we use as part of the sweat rate. Take the patches off, weigh themselves again, and that now we have all the information we want, or all the, let's say, all the information we want, so that way we can have a good understanding of how much they are losing in terms of fluid per hour and how much sodium that fluid is carrying from there.
Yeah, it was funny because when I met with Gabby a couple of weekends ago, I joked that I was feeling pretty nervous driving to meet Gabby because I was worried that it might be that I'm not a sweater at all, and that I might have to be running for like over an hour to generate enough sweat. But very quickly, I think I was running 2Ks in one direction. Very quickly, I was like, "Oh shit, I am sweating a lot." So yeah, no, it was funny when I was sort of running back. I was like, I think we've got enough sweat here to get enough for the sweat test analysis. So we mentioned briefly what my results were in last week's weekly app, but with no authority whatsoever. So let's dive into some of the results, Gabby. What How sweaty and salty am I?
So just for context for everybody, the run that Simon ended up doing lasted 30 minutes at marathon pace, at his target marathon pace. The temperature then was 21 degrees, and humidity was around 58%. Now, through those conditions, Simon's sweat rate ended up being 2.94 liters per hour, so almost 3 liters per hour, which places him in a category of well above average in terms of the sweat rate classification. For a male athlete, anything above 2 liters an hour is well above average. And what would be considered average in this case for a male athlete, 1.2 to 1.6. And for a female athlete, around zero point 0.9 to 1.2 would be an average sweat rate. So those were Simon's results for sweat rate. something that I always like to highlight, and that's why I started with the conditions, is that if Simon had been running in warmer conditions or moving faster, it's extremely likely his sweat rate would have been even higher. So, for
Mm.
example, let's assume that this marathon is going to be in really humid, really hot environment. Then we will have to plan for even higher sweat rate in that case. Of course, if the opposite is were to happen, if you're like, oh, actually, I'm going to run a 100 miler and this is going to be in the middle of winter and it gets really cold, well, we can't assume that the sweat rate is going to be that high the whole time because the conditions we used during the test were not necessarily the same. Now, in terms of the sodium losses, from the patches and the information we like, well, the samples we gather, his sweat sodium concentration is 1,000 milligrams per liter, which also places him in a classification well above average. So essentially, Simon is a very heavy and salty sweater, which it's not necessarily the ideal combination because it means that we are losing a lot of sweat, and then that sweat is carrying a lot of salt as well. Just for reference for people, in terms of an average sweat sodium classification for male athletes, we're talking about 800 to 900 milligrams per liter. And for female athletes, between 700 to 800 milligrams per liter will be an average sodium loss. Um, those are the results. I am assuming, guys, we want to talk about what does that mean in terms of what do we do with this information.
Yeah, definitely. I think I was just laughing in my mind then about the thought of Simon losing 3 liters an hour for a 100 miler. He just vaporizes into nothing at some point.
Yeah, it makes me very nervous doing those sort of races. But you're right. I suppose you're not exerting that amount of effort. But yeah, I mean, even running 42Ks with that level of potential loss in both sweat and salt is crazy. Like it just blew my mind when you were running the results through with me later that week. So um, yeah, I mean, it validates. I know. I think when you were on in episode 61, we were talking about cramping and what causes cramping, and I suppose this is a potential answer as to why cramping could be caused through these two issues.
Yeah, very likely. And as because I know we talk about how I see it as pieces of a puzzle because cramping is hard to study
Mm,
and often we look at different aspects. One of them, which is definitely the biggest one, is muscle conditioning. But
mm,
because in your case, that box is extremely well ticked. You've been training for such a long time, you've been running really well. That is something that is unlikely to happen. If, let's say, yeah, like for example, right now, if I try and go and sprint, I'm very likely I'm going to cramp if I just do it from out of nowhere or something like that. So that's one. The other one is, of course, sometimes it's a genetic component. Some people are more prone to cramping, but of course, then understanding what are your fluid losses, your sodium losses, also is helpful because at the end of the day, electrolytes are important for the muscle contraction, and they could be associated to this as well. Uh, and in this case, the fact that the fluid is also quite like the fluid losses are high, it is possible that either the electrolytes or the lack of fluid are causing this or are associated with your cramps essentially.
mm.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, we know now that Simon's fluid loss is something like 150% well above average. And his sweat loss is something like 10% above that. Like, what does that mean now for Simon's nutritional needs for his marathon based on the results?
Yes. So in the case of the fluid losses, ideally when we are for maintain to maintain adequate hydration, the American College of Sports Medicine recommends avoiding losing more than 2% of your body weight. Now I know I had the calculation when I spoke with Simon. I don't have it here, but it was extremely unrealistic to achieve that in the case of the marathon
Yeah.
for Simon with his sweat rate. So what we ended up aiming for was sort of 5%, I believe.
Mm,
And actually I have that here. If we were yeah, so actually I have it. So if we wanted a 2% dehydration, for Simon to finish the race with not less than 2% of his body weight, he needed to drink 2.5 liters an hour, which it's really like it's impossible essentially in a
Yeah.
marathon. There's no way that's going to happen. Now, if we move to 5% dehydration, it's still quite high. It's 1.8 liters per hour. Now, this is again remembering that everything remains the same. But for example, in this case, when the test was done at marathon pace, we're expecting Simon to hold marathon pace through the whole marathon. So in this case, what we discussed was, okay, let's try and first get you comfortable drinking way more than what you're used to, because I believe it was close to, let's say, 500 mils an hour at this
Hmm.
stage. So we want to get as much as we can. Uh, that's the first thing. We don't want to lose that much fluid. We want to replenish as much of that as possible. Definitely impossible to replenish 100%. Even for people who are not that heavy sweaters, replenishing 100% of the losses can be really hard anyway. And we do have that wiggle room of like, there's still, let's say, the possibility of performing well with a percentage of dehydration anyway.
Hmm.
So that is from the fluid component. From the sodium component, uh, if we, let's say, multiply that, for every liter of sweat that he's losing 1,000 milligrams of sodium, and then in 1 hour we're losing almost 3 liters. It means that pretty much per hour we're losing 3 grams of sodium in that case. And what the recommendations say are to initially start with at least 25% of those losses in terms of replenishment. So, in terms of that 25%, it means consuming, for Simon's case, 800 milligrams of sodium per hour, which is not as hard. There are definitely products that are higher in sodium, and that definitely we could use. I know Simon uses the Peaks energy gels, which are probably among the energy gels that I know with the most sodium, which is
Hmm.
extremely helpful in this case. 800 milligrams an hour is definitely higher than what I would normally recommend for someone who I haven't done a sweat test for. Normally, the recommendation sits between 300 to 600 if we don't have that information. But of
Hmm.
course, because Simon is a salty sweater, we do want to do more. So that would be the 25%. And there's, let's say, the possibility of even pushing to 50%, which is 1600 milligrams. Uh, it's never recommended to do 100% of that, mostly because it's a lot of sodium, and in
Hmm.
most cases it's not required. So starting with those targets as a like starting point is preferable. Something that I know Simon may discuss as well is, and that's why I want to mention it, is that ideally we don't want to make drastic changes so close to race day, but because we know that in your case this is something that has been affecting your performance and how much you've been preparing for this, we don't
Hmm.
want to risk having this information and not doing something about it.
Hmm.
So that's why it's like, okay, let's try within reason as to get you to an optimal consumption, knowing the time that we have in front of
Ye-
us.
Yeah, definitely. I think like since we spoke, I've played around with, I guess, not only consuming gels, which I had been sort of testing throughout my Saturday and my Sunday sessions, is like just being able to consume those 2 Bix gels in an hour, which already was feeling like quite a lot. But now adding the 500 ml sort of flask to the mix with the what I've put in there is the precision tablets in, or the precision mix in there. So there's a bit of sodium in there as well. So I've been practicing that since we last spoke, and I feel like that is a happy medium at this point. So it's nothing too drastic, but it's still, I guess, being a little bit intentional, following on from the results, and knowing that consuming all that fluid and being able to maintain marathon pace or efforts is very unrealistic with 2 weeks to go, basically.
Mm, yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure. And that's the biggest thing here is with the time we have available, the what you're doing right now is the best thing. Is
Mm.
not suddenly trying to do a lot, because it's going to be very difficult to sustain even if your body actually needs it. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about hydration. Most people expect that because you are losing that fluid, your body easily is going to absorb it. Like you're just going
Mm.
to be drinking water and it's going to be so easy to actually do it. And the thing is that that's something that we also need to train, starting by the stomach capacity. And we obviously don't want to suddenly drink a lot of fluid and and expect our body to tolerate it. So with the time that we have now, definitely getting you to a point where you find yourself comfortable is very helpful.
Yeah, excellent. We spoke about potentially doing a hyperhydration protocol on race morning, and I think since we then spoke at the time, I tried that the next day, but I didn't wake up the 3 hours beforehand. I think I squeezed it in a 90-minute period, and I think I suffered the consequences of that at the workout that morning. But could you talk to the listeners about the hyperhydration protocol and the use of glycerol for that?
Yes. So, in circumstances where, for example, in this case, Simon, you're a heavy sweater, we aren't going to be in a marathon where access to fluid at the rate that you need it is going to be very difficult. So, what we do with a hyperhydration is sort of almost the equivalent of a carbohydrate loading, where we are obviously loading on the fuel. In this case, we're loading on the fluid. And to achieve that, unfortunately, it's not enough to just drink water. In the case of water, normally we just get to, let's say, a hydrated state, and from there the body gets rid of everything else. So what we want is to try and retain that fluid. And there are different approaches that will help with that fluid retention. One of them is glycerol, or the other one will be sodium, or we can use them in combination. So glycerol is essentially a sugar alcohol that, due to its osmotic ability, let's say, supports fluid retention. So having that glycerol with water will help retain that water that we're consuming. And what research shows is that if we, on top of that, add sodium to that mix, that is going to help retain even more fluid. The let's say annoying thing about this protocol is that, for example, like carb loading, we're doing this days before the event. In the case of this hyperhydration, we need to do it the morning of. And as you mentioned, ideally we want to do this between 1.5 hours to 3 hours before the race. And we want to finish consuming this like at least, let's say, 1 hour before the race. So it means that minimum 2 hours beforehand, you want to be already drinking these concentrated, let's say, drink. In terms of the quantities, so we want 1.2 to 1.4 grams of glycerol for every kilo of body weight, mixed with 25 milliliters of fluid for every kilo of body weight. So it means that eventually we have that. I think I put it for you here. So in your case, Simon, it was
Ends up being 1.6 liters or
liters of
something.
fluid, and it was 78 minimum, let's say 80 grams of glycerol in that case, what you needed. And then we also, to add the sodium, which is helpful, we want to add 3 grams of sodium for every liter. So in your case, it was equivalent to 4.9 grams of sodium. Now, the thing is that because it's a lot of volume, we're drinking 1.6 liters. Let's say at least 90 minutes before the race starts is something that it's important to practice. I will never advise someone to do this right before the marathon, because it's not something that we want to make sure that the athlete is comfortable. So we do want to practice this beforehand and ensure that things are working well. The other thing to consider is, because we are loading on water, naturally body weight is going to increase. We are adding that extra weight, at least 1.6 kilos from that fluid. So that is something else to consider, that even though like there's going to be extra weight to carry during that race, but it's almost like, let's say, the way I see it, as if you are emptying the fuel tank of the car just because you want to make it lighter because you are heading very far. It's like, well, you're not going to move anywhere. So very similar with, let's say, carb loading and fluid intake in general.
Yeah, so I think so we caught up on the Friday, and I had a session on Saturday, and I went, you know what, just going to give this a go and see how I fare. Sort of, the marathon session the next day. My session started at 5:30 a.m. So there was no way I was going to wake up 3 hours beforehand for it. So I thought I'd try and squeeze in as much liquid in me. I think from 4 a.m. And I think I paid the consequences like instantly. So when I started running, it felt like I had so much in me and I just couldn't hit the paces at all. And I kind of the session kind of went into the bin. But fortunately, quite some time later, I was able to hit roughly marathon pace. So I did think it was a timing thing. And after I went to the toilet, I felt okay. So since then, I've tried it for 2 runs where I've woken up early. Well, I've started consuming it much earlier, and now I think I'm at a happy level. So I don't think I'll try the 1.6 liters necessarily, but I'm going to try, I think, roughly a liter's worth, because it's probably the most that I'm comfortable with, I suppose, without risking it too much on marathon morning. So it's been an interesting insight in terms of, I guess, trial and error, and like you said, with only 2 weeks to go at the time, I didn't want to push it too much.
No, definitely. I'm glad you found a point where you are comfortable and that, because at the end, and this is very important for everyone, for me, it's very important that when someone steps into the start line of a race, they feel confident in their ability to do it well. And if we start with like a protocol that we never tried, a bag full of gels that we've never eaten, like everything is like, even from a psychological perspective, is going to make it harder. So we want to make sure that it's been tested, that is giving you that confidence that it's going to go well. And yes, because psychological, but also physiologically, we know that it's going to work as well.
Yeah, for sure. I guess what is there any downside in adding carbohydrate mix to that, hyperhydration protocol that Simon's got there? And is there, I guess, are there downsides to too much sodium? Like what are the, I guess, the pros and cons of both of those things?
Yeah, definitely. So, in terms of the carbohydrate mix, I would suggest it's a good idea, especially if we're adding like a um, isotonic mix. Even though we're essentially making an hypertonic mix with the glycerol and the sodium and everything. But if on top of that we add something that is very dense in carbohydrate, that's going to make it extremely difficult to tolerate. But adding something, when I say isotonic, the easiest options are Gatorade, Powerade, Maximus, something like that. The benefit of doing that is also makes it more palatable. Simon, I don't know if you have any comments in terms of that, because I'm assuming it wasn't that pleasant to drink anyway.
Yeah, it was shit. So I did. So I did mix it with a bit of Powerade powder just to make it a little bit sweeter. So it was still not pleasant, but it was tolerable.
Yeah, no, that's good. And yeah, like as part of that, let's say counting of sodium, we obviously consider how much is in that mix. Powerade and Gatorade, they are very low in sodium anyway, but it's still important to account for that. So yeah, it's definitely a good idea. And Chris, I don't remember if you mentioned a second part of that question, and I think I haven't addressed it.
Yeah, no, it was to do with sodium consumption. So, like, if for whatever reason Simon was to chuck in twice as much sodium as he was supposed to, or whatever, is there a downside to doing that? I have kind of heard of people, competing in Ironmans, and they sometimes overdo it on the sodium, and it can potentially ruin their race as well.
Yeah, definitely. So the biggest risk there will be a stomach upset, and it could potentially cause diarrhea. Even though we are trying to retain fluids, the way essentially our intestine works is that it means that it could essentially get things loose down there. So that's why it's really, really important to test it and make sure that things are working well. Now, thankfully, and that's why it's advised to do it so early before the race, it means that by the time you start, things have been sorted, even if that's the case. So we do want to try and have it as early as possible within reason, because we know that sleep is important. That's why sometimes science is amazing, but then when you go to execute it, it's like, oh, okay, hang on. There are too many layers that we need to consider as part of this. But yeah, if we can within reason have it as early as possible, it's going to be helpful.
Yeah, nice. No, good answer. So I guess we'll round it back to the backyard ultra. We started off this way. We'll probably head this way. Simon's doing Hurdies next year. He's been kind of pulled into the Wolves Run Club, and they've got a team going. Is there any of this advice that you've given him for a marathon that is applicable to backyard ultras, or is there something else he should be considering from a nutritional point of view?
Mm. Yeah, I would say almost everything would be different. One of the things, and that's why I always talk about fuel with purpose. And what that means is we need to understand why we're doing something. So if we look at the race format itself, there's like essentially is opposite extremes if we compare marathon versus backyard ultra. The objective of a marathon for most people, even if they say they just want to have fun, for most people is still going to be finish that marathon as fast as possible. That is
Mm.
everyone's objective. Yes, some people could be like Simon aiming top three, other people will be like, I just want to make cutoff, but we want to finish as fast as possible. The objective of a backyard ultra is I want to be there for as long as possible. I want to stay there consistent loop after loop. So what that means is that nutritionally, in the case of a marathon, we're more aggressive because we want the body to be as quick and as efficient as possible, which means that's why we prioritize lots of carbs and those things. In the case of a backyard ultra, we want to maintain that energy influx while keeping the body really happy the whole time.
Mm.
So those aggressive approaches are very likely to backfire in a situation like that. And the thing is that because we want to be there for so long, as much as carbohydrate is really helpful for energy and is still the thing that I prioritize, there are other nutrients that we need to start considering as part of this plan, like protein, for example.
Mm.
So definitely very different. Something because you ask in terms of like, okay, but what about like in terms of these lessons that we're taking into the marathon? What is the biggest one for a backyard ultra? Definitely the hydration. Hydration has to be on like in a case of a backyard ultra for people to get as far as possible. We do want to stay as hydrated as possible. If we think of course, Simon, I'm assuming you're not planning to do the loops at marathon pace. But if we think that pretty much every loop you are close to losing 3 liters, because let's assume you're doing them quick, um, it means that by the time you get to actually loop two, you're already short 6 liters. And obviously, we don't want that. So it means that we want to stay on top of that. I would say, for example, in your case, Simon, definitely for example, herdis is something that is likely to be hot. So we don't want to push the body too hard to the point that your sweat rate increases so much. And
Mm.
because the benefit of a backyard ultra is that it's way easier to drink the fluid because you can definitely have it with you on the loop. And then once you stop, you can continue to replenish that fluid. So that's definitely going to be very helpful. Knowing the race and your sweat rate, I probably, in your case, and this is not for everybody, in your case, I will prioritize more of the liquid calories
Mm.
because that way we are reducing volume to your gut. Because
Mm.
if there's so much you can tolerate and we need to prioritize that fluid, definitely having more of that carbohydrate coming from the liquid will be helpful while we can supplement the extras with a little bit of snacks and things like that.
Mm. Something to think about. I don't know how far I'm planning to do the backyard ultra. I'm not going to be taking Phil's record anytime soon. So, but yeah, definitely something to take into consideration. All right, that's good to know. All right, well, before we wrap up, I've got a couple of quick fire questions for those preparing for either Goldie or Bibra Lake Marathon this weekend or Sydney Marathon in 9 weeks' time. So I think when we had you on last time, we talked about general approaches to carb loading heading into a race. Is there an optimal number of days, and what was that guide in terms of like what we should be trying to aim for in terms of a carb load prior to a marathon?
Yeah, definitely. So, in case of the carb loading for a marathon specifically, uh, I wouldn't say there's necessarily an optimal number of days. What ideally we want is between 2 to 3 days. And from my experience, that's going to depend more on the next part, which is the carbohydrate target. So, ideally, we want to consume between 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilo of body weight per day. So, for example, if someone is leaning on the lower side of that intake, let's say on the 8 grams, let's say, in that case, I will say, okay, let's do 3 days ideally, because that way we're consuming more carbohydrate in the lead up. If
Mm.
we're on the 12-gram side, then 2 days should be enough. And if that's the case, I strongly encourage people to please try that beforehand, because it's a lot of carbohydrate. A lot of people, once you try and do a carbohydrate loading right, you realize how much food you need to consume. So those are the numbers in terms of we want 2 to 3 days, 8 to 12 grams per kilo. Um, in terms of options, I do want to say, don't be afraid of the energy dense ones. Jam, honey, sugary drinks, those things are going to make it way easier to load on the carbohydrate.
Mm.
It doesn't mean that you're going to open a jam jar and just eat that, but it does mean that if you're going to have bread, you can have it with jam, and that's going to boost the carbohydrate. Or if you're having your lunch, you can have it with a soft drink, even though it feels, because most of the people I work with are very health conscious, and like the idea of drinking soft drink with a meal feels like not correct. But in this case, it's going to be very helpful because we are loading on those carbohydrates and making it easier to squeeze them in options that are compact.
Yeah, for sure.
Excellent.
Sorry, so I was just going to say, so yeah, I guess even if these might be foods that we do eat regularly, I guess the importance is that we need to actually practice eating them in high volumes, or a variety of foods in high volumes before our key races, so that our stomach is ready to know what it feels like the day of a race, right?
Oh, absolutely. And ideally, if we can reduce fat as much as possible, that is going to be very helpful. There are so many options that, let's say, are very energy dense and carbohydrate dense, but also really fat dense. And that's when it can be challenging to be comfortable the whole carb loading process.
Yep. So, ice cream. So, so my second question is fueling, I guess, on race morning. What time should we be eating our first meal, and how much and what sort of foods should we be targeting the morning of?
So we want to consume between 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrate per gram of per gram of body weight. So hang on, 1 to 4 grams per kilo of body weight. Yes,
Yep.
there you go. uh, 1 to 4 hours before the race. So let's say the rule of thumb is, if you're going to choose 1 gram, or if you have 1 hour to eat, then you choose 1 gram per kilo. So let's say for a obviously 70-kilo athlete, beats 70 grams of carbs. If you have or are willing to have 4 hours before race day, then in that case it's helpful to aim for 4 grams per kilo. So that way you have a way bigger meal. That we're talking in that case 280 grams. We're talking about that same 70-kilo athlete, which even that can be challenging. So ways, for example, if this person is actually targeting 4 hours before the race, it means that we could potentially split it. So we could have a, let's say, 150-gram meal first, and then 130-gram sort of a snack 1 hour, or probably 90 minutes before starting as well. In
Yeah,
terms of the
true.
types of foods, we do want mostly carbohydrate, reduce fat as much as possible. And the further out you are from race start, the, let's say, okay it is to consume protein. So, for example, if someone is at the 4 hour mark, in that case, we could have a little bit more protein. It's not
Mm.
like we want to eradicate it the closer we get, but the less helpful it becomes and the more in the way it gets, because we want to absorb that carbohydrate quickly, and the protein sort of reduces or slows down that absorption. So the closer you are to race time, you reduce protein. The further you are, you still could include it without necessarily targeting protein as a key component of it.
Yeah.
Mm.
So no sculling egg whites on the start line.
No, definitely not.
That's a recipe for disaster.
Never.
Jesus. Yeah. And finally, from me, so we did the sweat test in person. Is there alternative sweat tests that like people can participate in? So if they didn't want you lurking outside the Optus Stadium toilets, is there alternative versions of the sweat test?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of my clients are actually interstate. So what I do is I send them the sweat test kit. So it means that I send them the patches, the instructions, everything they need to do the test themselves. As you saw, Simon, the test is a little bit faffy. We do need to be very careful with the patches. Uh, and that's something I emphasize when I send the instructions. Say like, make sure that you're careful in terms of how you handle the patch. Most people do really well in terms of doing that. So that's one option in terms of getting the whole picture, as we did in your case, which is the sodium losses and the sweat rate. However, if someone is curious in terms of understanding more about their sweat, this is something that everybody can do from home with a weight scale in terms of understanding the sweat rate. So it's a matter of pretty much weighing yourself before and after your run. And of course, like there's a formula. If we're looking at liters per hour, well, all you have to do is how much weight you lose in set time and divide it. And then from there, we get the total. Um, so that's something that I definitely encourage people to start exploring in general. So at least you get a better understanding. Right now, here in Perth, we're in the middle of winter. It's worth doing. Like if you have a 1 hour run or whatever, do a sweat test just to see how much you're losing at winter time. Even if your race is in summer, because at least it gives you an idea of like what is happening with your sweat right now. Then of course, if the race is in summer, 100% do another one as you're approaching summertime, so that way you have a better understanding of how your body responds on these circumstances, and it makes it easier to start planning hydration with that information.
Wow. Yeah. No, that's good. I mean, good advice. I think it's a good time of year now, especially with Perth Running Festival coming up, right? It's a hot, typically a hot race, and right now it's the perfect time to get it in. We're probably 8 or 9 weeks out from race day, so if anyone's considering it, now's the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Definitely. And yeah, thanks for that, Chris, because definitely it's important to start exploring that. And it's helpful, for example, if they were to do it now, we'll be like, okay, we know that as in this time of the year, and then as we're approaching the race, which is going to be warmer, let's do another sweat rate just to have that information for comparison as well.
Yeah, for sure. No, thanks, Gabby. Yeah, great advice as always. We're very happy to have you on again. What you've shared is amazing, and it looks like Simon's got some very good insights into his, the science of his running at the moment. So hopefully that can help him reach his goals on Sunday. How about you tell the listeners how they can reach you and get in touch?
Yeah, of course. So the easiest way to reach out to me would be my Instagram. So you can find me as at Intenseatfit. That's my business name, but also my pretty much like profile online. And otherwise, my website is intenseatfit.com. There is a free quiz available there. So if it's essentially an audit, people complete 30 multiple choice questions, and it gets you a better idea of what your fuel looks like, or like the way you're fueling yourself looks like, and what are the gaps that you can start addressing. So that's I would suggest for someone who's curious in understanding how's their nutrition going, definitely a very easy to use and free tool that they can start with.
Fantastic. No, thanks, Gabby. Yeah, we greatly appreciate your time and your wisdom, as always, and for sharing your advice with us today. Thanks again for joining us on the WA Running Podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. And I hope you both have a great time at the marathon.
Hope so. Yeah. Thanks, Gabby.
Fingers crossed.
Are you going to consider sorbet, Chris, or are you still going to be ice cream on Saturday?
I think I might be converted.
I'll let you know, Gabby, whether or not he has sorbet or ice cream.